During your reflection on memory from your childhood, there was a particular line which really captivated me. You say, "I didn't want to be too busy being black." Can you elaborate on that and what that means within the themes of this event?
Well, I suppose for me, and again, I suppose one of the things, one of the questions we were looking at later probably is about being political in your writing. For me, being black in a completely white environment was always about being conscious of who you were, and it's also about racist performance. So racist performance is about always either taming who you are, pretending you're somebody else, laughing at jokes that you don't really find funny, but you have to fit in because, come on, we didn't mean it. We're only messing, we're only slagging, it's only a joke. So to be black is always about performance in that kind of environment. And your life can be taken over by being right on all the time. You know, so you can be fighting the good fight all of the time instead of just getting on with your life. So I think most white people are not conscious every day that they are white. They are just people getting on with their lives. But if you're different, then that difference can impact on everything you do. So when you go into the supermarket or you walk on the street and a white person pulls their bag or they look behind and they see you, you suddenly have to become non-threatening. So again, racist performance. You have to smile. I smile all the time. I kind of escalate people's fear. I bring it down so that I'm not the black person. So I'm being black. I'm being black, consciously being black, but being non-threatening black, you know. So when I went to London for the first time, I understood that much more for the very first time because I started to meet black people who didn't smile because somebody was threatened by them. And I began to understand how I was behaving and how I was so busy trying not to threaten people because they saw me in some particular way. And that's what I mean by being busy. I don't want to spend my time being busy, being black. I just want to get on with life. Yeah. So that's what I mean. And I don't always want to be political. You know?
Thank you for that wonderful elaboration. I think on the theme of, I think, bodies as spectacle, that's what I get from what you've said, is that within the performance of being black, you're constantly put on a stage where you're not allowed the privacy of your own identity. You have to constantly sort of cater to other people's like perceptions and their stereotypes and their assumptions. I suppose, like Ian, that really feeds into your writing as well. And I really loved when you spoke of, you know, like the settled traveler as being tamed or tameable. Do you think that perhaps like settledness is seen as like a kind of like representation of like civilization within the Irish society?
I do, and actually what comes across quite often in our open narratives, and actually even like 2 weeks ago in the Irish Times, travellers were described as being about 50 to 60 years behind the settled community. It almost says that the settled community is the standard, you know, and it almost says we're on the same linear path as our settled peers, rather than on two entirely different journeys, you know. And existing in a world about 2 years ago, where our actual ethnic identity wasn't even recognised. The fact is that any time we talked about culture, people only really talked about our issues. The vast majority of people have no idea of what a traveller culture actually is. And then when we kind of, it was almost like we were invoking, calling down upon ourselves like systematic cultural and structural issues. That we opted in, we was like, you know, I want to die kind of like 50-50 by the age of 38. You know, I want that. I want to have like live in a society where over 80% of my family and my community can't find employment. You know, like I totally want to opt into that because that's, you know, that's my gig, you know. And so I think sometimes what it was that from policy to policy and living in a world, it's almost that, especially if people, and the vast majority of Irish people, don't know culture and the nuances around it, it's almost that that you become like that, almost as if they want people to be settled, and they want you to be like, we can't see how you're different, and like I'd like to point out as well, kind of though a little bit more political, because I think that there's very few things we can't but be political. 2 weeks ago, a young Trevor woman took a case against a pub that didn't allow her in, and which is very curious in our language. So we don't say we went out; we say we got in. Yeah, which we don't go out at night. We get in, and her case was thrown out, and it was covered really poorly by a national newspaper actually. But it was thrown out by the judge, who decided she didn't look Trevor enough. It's almost as if she didn't look Trevor enough to feel the brunt of that discrimination. It was almost like going, that situation, as horrible as it is, we don't feel that you look Trevor enough to qualify for this protection, so we're just going to dismiss it. So when I talk about our current narratives, our lives, that it's very hard not to talk about those struggles, but at the same time, there's so much in us and in our community that gets silenced because of that higher call. And I think sometimes that what we need to say is we need to be very conscious as well, is that there's other voices that are not, like you're saying, kind of fighting that fight. Outwardly, they're most certainly internally, but that's part of the stories I want to hear. I want to hear more of my own community's folk tales. I want to hear about our beautiful stories. I want to hear about our history. I don't just want to hear about the struggle. Yes. While it is always deeply important, it is smothering our other voices in our songs.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I feel educated by hearing about that court case that got thrown out. And I suppose on the topic of sort of using literature and performance and folklore and tradition to create a more embodied and nuanced idea of, a cultural identity, so that we're not just our struggles, we're also our celebrations, we're also our desires. And that's what I really loved. Like when I researched your work online, what I was struck by is just the beauty and the celebration of embodied sensation that's in your work. And I feel like that's something that's often left out in Black literature or minority literature, because we only feel pain, we don't feel pleasure, We don't get to enjoy nice food or lovely touches from our significant others. We're just, always in pain. So can you elaborate more on that aspect of your work?
Yeah, thank you, Shamaka. That's a really astute observation, which I do also find. I think, for me, the body is always the beginning of everything. You are located in a body, you are an embodied being. And therefore, everything that you experience comes to you through the body. French philosopher Derrida says, a poet is someone who gives language a new body, and I think that's what poetry can do. It can allow you to access a part of yourself that you get to define what that's going to be. Other people don't define it for you. And so in that way, I think poetry is really transgressive, because you are transgressing the structures of a given language. I think it's Ali Smith who says, whoever makes up the story makes up the world. So it's really important to welcome people into the home of your story. And I think, for me, it's really important to give people something that they can hang on to as well. So it's not just, here's my story, sit down and listen, but you feel this too, right? You know this too, right? Do you remember this time? And I think it's that sort of conspiracy almost, that you create a language that you can share with someone else, where they suddenly become part of your private, intimate space, even for a moment. And I think that's what really draws me to poetry especially, but any kind of work with language, because I think that there is a certain, there's a sort of, whenever you make a movement towards another being who is not you, I think you start to create a community, a city, a polis in a way. So I think that in that sense, any kind of art, it forms the bedrock for a more imaginative politics, like it's the starting point. So that's why.
I love that. Art forms the bedrock of a more imaginative politics. Can we just get an applause for that? That's pure poetry. That just like brought shivers down my spine. I hope you all made notes from my reading because I couldn't make the notes. So I'll be expecting questions. So we had amazing words from Christy Candiwa, and you performed that wonderful poem, which, tell me again the Shona name of it.
The Shona name is Nguva ichampupuri chinosumuzamu kwakwa mudenga, which translates to time, the gale that heaves the earth into the heavens.
Have you ever heard anything more beautiful? It really is a song. And I suppose what really struck me from that piece is this idea that we should thread with tenacity. And do you feel that perhaps the work for you is a medium in which you tread with tenacity?
You know what? Very much so. I think it's not a lot of time that we all get space to speak, but for me, poetry and writing has always been like a page will accept anything you write on it. It will. And sometimes you don't have the strength to speak things into existence or to speak things into your atmosphere. And I think writing that down almost as a projection of yourself it's a very slow but empowering way of accepting the little bits of you that sometimes have to be hidden or sometimes you feel have to be hidden for everybody to accept. Yeah.
And tell us more about because the poem is first of all embodied within your linguistic traditions. So tell us more about that cultural tradition that informs the work as well, and why it's important for you to inject that into your poetry.
Well, first of all, I haven't been writing in Shona since I was born up until 6 months ago. And it was mostly kind of like an acceptance of my identity. And being both Zimbabwean and Irish, I think it's a lot of the time you have to pick. You have to pick when to be Irish and when to be... You can never be both at the same time in the same space, besides family maybe. But yes, am I answering that properly?
You are.
Okay, good. Yeah, just making sure everybody's getting that. But yeah, so for me, it's been more of a journey of kind of now starting to borrow on all these things that are in me, that are Shona, all these Zimbabwean culture that's within me that I don't always get to explore. And because I get to explore a lot in English just because I speak it all the time, but you don't get that same strength and that same emotion when you're writing in a different language. It's a different ballgame altogether.
It's a different ballgame altogether. Thank you for that. And I think we can all admit that we all felt pretty played by Chinedum's performance. You played us.
Played you? How did I play you?
We were not Hesperian.
It was unhesperied.
It was unhesperied.
I like to, I think, in terms of the work that I do, I like to, especially when I get opportunities like this to be in new spaces with new and beautiful people, I think to always push the boundaries and try what is unexpected. And again, goes around to, what was mentioned at the beginning around performance and expectations of performance. I think it becomes problematic when one is forced, especially with the use of certain languages and certain histories, to fit within what is expected of them. I think for me it was interesting as well because it was unexpected for me. This was unplanned. This was, when I say a work in progress, as in work in progress over the last couple of hours. Like literally, and those that really know me closely and have dealt with my work, such as Alice Feldman, will know that, very little plans go into the things I do. And I think there is a beauty to that because I think for me, in terms of what I'm doing, I'm trying to invoke that, I think, somewhat of a spiritual aspect and take and go to places as well as bring people to places that they haven't been before. I think there has to be an aspect of discomfort and within my art and within what I do. And I think just as I'm speaking a lot, I'd like to dedicate my performance and me being here and within the seat to all the women that have sacrificed so much for me that I can never imagine for me to be here. I think it's so important just to acknowledge that. Yeah.
I want to get you to speak a lot more about this idea that oral traditions allows improvisation, and which obviously pertains to the fact that our established the imperial imposition, to quote my own work, how obnoxious, of English, of the Anglo-Saxon of language, which often, I suppose, limits perhaps our expression, because there are a lot of languages in which the words, especially in German, cannot be translated into English appropriately, because it's just like the embodied experience of the word is almost like sanctified within the actual language itself. And I want you to talk a little bit about how performing and writing poetry in your own tongue allows for a fuller embodiment of your identity, and also if perhaps the ability to do so and the result of that is alienation of people who don't speak the language, if that you feel is a luxury or you think that's a social right.
I should have written her question down. I just remembered. I think if I start from where you ended, I think, this idea of, transposing words and meanings and, translations. I don't know. I doubt if there are a lot of languages that translate directly into English. I think instead it's the imposition of English upon other languages that forces it to morph itself into something foreign that it isn't. I think for me, writing with Igbo was interesting because it wasn't a case where I was trying not to anyways. It wasn't a case where I was writing and then translating. I was thinking directly into Igbo and writing in Igbo. And for me, it was interesting as a project or as a space to be in, given that the language is something that's been taken and removed away from me and from my existence and reality. So I found that quite enriching as an experience. I think in terms of not translating, which I purposely chose not to, was a political act in terms of not translating. Because I feel like if you really listen to what I was saying, we all speak the same language and you understand where I was trying to take you. I think the words don't necessarily matter. I think we all play around with language, and I think for me, in terms of writing and with my art, or with literature, and with poems and being an artist, is how do you subdue a form to fit into what you're trying to do? And it was interesting as well when I was speaking to, I just realized I've said interesting a lot. It was quaint. In terms of when I was speaking to another Igbo brother of mine, and I was telling him, what I was trying to do, and I was like, Chuku biko yemaka, and he was like, no, you can't say that, that's wrong. I was like, what do you mean it's wrong? He was like, well, actually it's, and this is literally, because we had this conversation last night, so basically what you need to say is, Chineke yerem aka, for it to be grammatically correct. And I was like, listen, I'm an artist, I'm gonna do whatever I want. Like, don't tell me what the language does. I don't care what the language does. I'm gonna subdue it to do what I want to do. And that becomes interesting when you think about other languages and you think about, this idea, language is linked to tradition, language is linked to identity. People identify themselves and shape themselves through their language and literature. So, in that case, did I just bastardize my own language? Am I allowed to, as someone, within the diaspora, someone that is Igbo, and, he was giving me this whole, kind of like spiel. This is me linking into my Dublinness or Irishness. This whole spiel around, well, you can't do that. But I was like, well, how many people do you know that are doing poetry in Igbo? He was like, no one. I was like, well, I can do whatever I want. So that was interesting as an act, in terms of being able to immerse oneself within it. And yeah, I think just really own it as my own, given that it's something that's been removed away from us. And, for so many of us have been removed away from things. Yeah. And I think I would end as well, seeing as I don't think anyone was taking notes. I have a question for you, Chiamaka. I think I found it quite interesting in terms of, you ended your poem with the fact that, home is where you last felt it. And I find it interesting on that note of home being where you last felt it, and someone that is in the active process of creating homes for other people who maybe to some extent are feeling it right here in Dublin or in Ireland, aren't feeling it in Dublin or in Ireland, have never felt it anywhere to some extent. For me, that sounds like a massive task and a burden on your end, given that as well you're a woman that already carries all these other burdens of creating homes and creating almost nations for people. How are you going about managing that and making people feel a sense of home?
How do I manage my own sense of home, or how do I manage other people's?
I think it's the dichotomy between the both of, managing your sense of home in terms of feeling home and recreating home, and as well as recreating that for others.
I give you a deep question, you give me a deep question. That's a remarkable question. Thank you for that. It's something that I had to dig deeper within myself to explore in order to write my own poems for the anthology, which I would keep plugging, coming with Dateless Press in October the 15th, the launch in Poetry Ireland. Did you all put that in your calendars? Okay. Because I'll be checking. But yeah, it's something I had to explore quite recently. And I'm very open with the fact that I was homesick from the age of 10 till 19, which is when I got to travel back to Nigeria and see my extended family. So that was an 8-9 year period where I was living in Ireland and I was partaking in social in social life. I was in school, I had friends, I was in different youth groups. I was already engaging with the creative and literary community in Dublin. And yet there was, I suppose, a deep unsettledness within me. And I think because like you said about, not looking enough like a traveler. I suppose because I at the time sounded a little bit more Irish, just to fit in, I suppose I didn't quite depict the standard vision of a homesick person, because I was doing all these things and I was quite outgoing, but I suppose the psychological impact of all of that performance of trying to settle in is that you acquire a very heavy burden where you're pushing your full identity deeper and deeper within you, and that obviously affects your work. So I had to then, do the project of asking myself where I feel at home, and just to come back to what you said about the page being the only place that will accept, all of you, the entirety of your consciousness. That was pretty much it for me. Is that I just read until I felt that I was alive again, essentially, and then I just kept writing and writing until I suppose I created the home for myself through poetry, and that came from a combination of both the Western literary tradition as well as my own Igbo, Nigerian, and Africa, broader literary traditions. The work of Wole Soyinka, of Amaedo Ayodo, of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Who am I thinking of right now? Thank you. Of Chinua Achebe. Shame on you. Shame on me.
I will never speak on your behalf.
Yeah, of all these great writers who also, grappled with the big questions of identity and consciousness and nationhood, and how all of those things, like, intertwine. So I think that literature is where you can make a home for yourself, and I suppose that then comes down to the question of that I want to pose to all of you of why it is important for us to amplify each other's narratives and voices, and if that is a project in itself of creating homes for ourselves after our individual experience of isolation within Irish society. Whoever wants to start can start.
I suppose in terms of, if you think of it in terms of Irish literature and the great voices of Irish literature, generally, and I'm not saying I believe this, tend to be male, because that's how they're positioned. So recently I went into Eason's, and they have the Irish literature and Irish fiction. And Irish literature is male, and Irish fiction is everybody else. So, and when you look at Irish literature, it's all about getting out. Joyce got out, Beckett got out, Kavanagh got out of Monaghan as quickly as he could.
Thank God
So
for that.
when you amplify the new voices, what you're amplifying are the people who want to get in. You're amplifying you and you and you and you. And we're amplifying us who are already in. So tonight, a night like tonight, where you're amplifying your voice by us putting our stories on paper, we amplify each other. And I think that's where the new voices need to amplify each other, because the Irish literature doesn't actually amplify our voices. So I think that's...
I think in terms of this idea of amplification, I think, it boils down to, I think, we should always remember that things that we're looking at, are systemic. It's not just, it's not by accident that they felt a need for this event to be created, which is a beautiful event. And thank you for everyone that came and everyone that's behind this and really set this up. And even to our cameraman as well, very important. Round of applause for him. I think, one of the things that always boils down to my mind, and this was said, during my time on the master's program, was this idea of solidarity. What does solidarity look like? What does it look like when, Chiamaka no longer needs to speak about issues that affect Chiamaka because I just naturally speak about it and I'm naturally challenging it? What does it look like when we are speaking about the issues of others so that they don't have to speak about it anymore? And we can focus on other things and actually start to feel new sensations and pleasures, as opposed to the pain and the hurt and being continuously political, because we cannot afford to just be kind of like jovial and say, ha ha ha, let's have the crack, blah, blah, blah. I think for me that's very important. And I really put that out to you guys and ladies. What does solidarity look like for you moving forward? What does it look like when people speak about issues that affect you? And sometimes we don't see the issues that affect us, when we think about things like, disability, and that being said of, not fitting into certain narratives. So if I don't have my 2 legs gone and, a missing arm, does that mean I'm not disabled if I don't hear too well? Or if my vision is quite impaired? I think for me, I'm curious about that solidarity. So I'm putting it back out to you guys.
We're coming to the end of our event, so I would like to open to the floor. Does anyone have any comments or questions that they would like to pose?
I have the mic.
So Chenny mentioned something very important that I also experience, and that's thinking in the language that is your mother tongue and translating into the other. Being British myself, I think in English. From maybe the age of 12, I started thinking in English, stopped thinking Arabic. But when I do explore Arab poetry, sort of this automatic thing clicks and I start to think in Arabic. And some of the poetry flows naturally from my tongue. And I can't think of it in English and translate it in Arabic. So to you guys, even if it's not a language, it's sort of an identity. Do you have anything similar that a language takes over or identity takes over when you get really into your creative zone? Or is there a bit of translation that happens? Because obviously the mainstream, most people here, they don't relate to you. Your identity is sort of smaller, and you're trying to show it to a bigger audience. Hey, this is who I am, and you might not understand if I completely talk in my tongue or in my identity. I sort of have to make it relative to you. So, how much of that happens to you guys? If anybody wants to speak on that.
It's a very good question.
I would actually like to answer that. For me, it's been kind of like exploring the two sides of you, right? Because, like I said, they're very polarized. And even though I speak Shona a lot, I speak English much more. So when I switched, I found that when I started switching, I would use my English brain to try construct Shona, the Shona part of me, into this kind of thing. But it didn't work. But the reason why I actually love translating my poetry now is that I can be both in both spaces. And my Shona part doesn't have to be English. Because I don't know if you guys speak two languages or if anybody does, but you're never the same person in two languages. Like there's another side of you that's amplified a little bit more. And imagining saying the same story with that little bit of you just a little bit louder in Shona and then another part of you louder in English, I think that's pretty beautiful.
Part of my work often has part of gammon in it. And I often find it very important to speak in gammon. Because, an example, it wasn't until last week that our language actually was recognised. It was incorporated into the UNESCO intangible cultural lists after it was being well documented. And I like the idea where people talk about the translation into the kind of the normative English. Vast majority of our dictionaries that survive are by quite English men, actually, going back to the 18th century. And they are thoughts and ideas I struggle with because I'm part of the generation who's ready to reclaim that language, reclaim those ideas. And the stuff that doesn't translate and should never translate. Like I would ask my father, what does tadir mean? And it kind of means strength, but kind of pride, but kind of tiredness, kind of like that thing when there's an ebb of a river, you know, kind of. So there's all these ideas that you kind of go kind of, and I think that in that space is where our part of our spirit lives. In that the idea that we don't have to fixate or mold ourselves and bend ourselves into this foreign idea of who we should be and how we should talk and how we should speak and how we should communicate, rather than just let us speak ourselves. But one thing that I really kind of feel from today, I've done some things like this in the past, is that I'm always wary of us not taking the challenge. And rather than like people from kind of a minority background, but actually as a collective society, one of my favourite sayings is going, have you seen who's not at the table? Have you seen who's not here? Do you know? And I think that in itself is both something that we claim to be very conscious of, but in reality we're not. Do you know, we really aren't. I think we do try. I do think we try to get as many diverse voices as possible and many diverse perspectives. But sometimes, I think that there is a time it's an intellectual kind of exploration rather than a felt feeling. You know, and one of the forms I really felt last night was not understanding the language, but feeling it, the passion. You know, and I think that's something that I think I want to carry with myself out of this, and to make sure that it's not just the words, it's not just the softness, the rawness of it. It's the real spirit.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you to you all for enduring the 15 minutes overtime. I'm just going to conclude on a statement by Yvonne Boland, who is the editor of Poetry Ireland Review, and she is part of the Diversity and Inclusion Council, which is part of the initiative from the Arts Council and Poetry Ireland to diversify art practices in Ireland and create more collaborative practices with marginalised and minority communities. And Yvonne Boland wrote that we need to emphasize the importance of diversity not simply because it is about the future of society, but because it points to the future of poetry. And I think that really sums up our enterprise and our project here, which is that our words will sort of create new sensations that everyone can also experience, and that it's not an intellectual practice. It's a human practice. Yeah. That there are nuances in all of our lives, and we should have the space to express those.